In the previous video we saw how the Messianic hope was strong in first-century Judaism, marked by the heavy Roman oppression over them, when a liberator was more than necessary. Generally, the Jews awaited a Messiah in the figure of a king who would restore the Davidic dynasty and form a universal empire. This second part presents how the authors of the canonical Gospels related the prophecies of the Hebrew Scriptures and the multiple Messianic figures to Jesus. We will see that some of them did not necessarily reflect the Jewish interpretation regarding the Messiah. Welcome to another episode of the channel. Subscribe and hit the bell to never miss a story. Please give a thumbs up and share with your friends. Sacred History, unveiling the sacred mysteries. In pre-Jesus Judaism there is certain evidence, such as in the book of Enoch, the apocalypses of Ezra and Baruch, that the servant of the Lord is indirectly identified as the Messiah. However, for theologian Oscar Cullmann, in the Judaism of Jesus' days, these figures, Messiah and suffering servant, were dissociated, and the idea of a suffering Messiah was strange. In the words of the Jews when Jesus mentions his death, "We have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever, and how do you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up?" John 12:34. They possibly had in mind passages like Isaiah 9:7, which declares that the prince, a descendant of David, would be established forever, and Psalm 72:17, which states that the name of the Messiah remains forever. According to the canonical Gospels, not even the disciples fully understood the figure of the suffering servant Messiah when Jesus spoke of his suffering, arrest, and death. But the evangelists construct a narrative that Jesus was never surprised by these events. As only the Gospel of Luke mentions this 7 times, they directly relate him to the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. However, in Jewish tradition, the suffering servant mentioned in Isaiah 53 was generally interpreted as a reference to the people of Israel themselves. For them, the chapter describes the sufferings and future redemption of the Jewish people as a whole, especially in the context of exile and the sufferings faced throughout history. This interpretation is supported by other passages in the book of Isaiah where Israel is called God's servant. For example, Isaiah 41:8-9, and Isaiah 49:3. Others, like Martin Hengel, who was a professor of New Testament studies at the universities of Erlangen and Tübingen, believe there is sufficient evidence in early Judaism to suggest that traditions of suffering and atonement by eschatological messianic figures were prevalent in Palestinian Judaism, and that Jesus and the early church could have known and appealed to them. Another figure associated with Jesus in the Gospels, especially in John, is the Son of God. According to Werner Kummel, a renowned German theologian, Son of God was not a Jewish designation for the expected Redeemer. Even though in Mark 1:11, Jesus hears a heavenly voice saying, "You are my beloved Son." He argues that understanding contemporary Jews of Jesus as interpreting this as an allusion to the Messiah is merely conjecture, mainly because it is not mentioned in Jewish tradition. There are accounts showing some Jewish men endowed with supernatural powers also being called sons of God or holy men of God. If so, then it is quite possible that some individuals to whom Jesus ministered might have greeted him as Son of God or Holy Man of God, as some of the narratives of his exorcism suggest. After the death of her brother Lazarus, Martha declares that she had believed that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God who was to come into the world. John 11:27. Clearly associating the figure of the Anointed One, or Messiah, promised with the expression Son of God. This expression appears 11 times in Matthew, 7 times in Mark, 9 times in Luke. It is interesting to note that, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus never calls himself the Son of God, but in John this happens 6 times. In summary, the term Son of God in Jewish tradition and the older Gospels seems to refer to a holy man sent by God and endowed with supernatural powers, whereas in the Gospel of John, it clearly aims to associate this expression with the Messiah and present him as God. Son of Man was Jesus' favorite designation for referring to himself in the Gospels, 82 times. Many scholars see Daniel 7:13 as the primary source in the Hebrew Bible for the use of this term. The text says, "And behold, one like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven." For Kummel, the Jewish listener could easily understand that it referred to an eschatological redemptive figure from God's world, which, like the Davidic Redeemer, could also be called the Anointed One. However, theologian Donald Carson argued that not everyone in Palestine could have made a secure connection between Son of Man and the Messiah. Unlike the Jewish leaders, the general populace was not fully versed in the theology of eschatological characters. Jesus' own disciples belonged to this simpler class, as they were considered unlearned by the rabbis. In the Gospels, there are at least 3 types of declarations in reference to the Son of Man. The first, Jesus applies with a modest sense to his person and earthly life. The second declaration relates to his suffering, and the third is a reference to the coming in glory. It is very interesting to note that in the book of Enoch, this expression, Son of Man, has a special highlight, and much of Jesus' apocalyptic content seems to have this book as a more abundant source than any other part of the Hebrew Bible. Did Jesus come to follow an agenda outlined in this apocryphal book of Judaism? This is what we will see in the next video on the channel. In today's episode, we discussed 3 figures widely applied to Jesus in the canonical Gospels: suffering servant, Son of God, and Son of Man. Indeed, the social and religious context of first-century Judaism was very complex and pluralistic. All these figures, as well as those mentioned in the previous video, could have had their place in a given context. However, none seemed as strong in Judaism in general as a Messiah king from the lineage of David. The Gospels in turn utilized the many existing figures of the time and related them to Jesus, and Christianity became the world's largest religion in a few centuries.